Hey guys, tonight we're stepping into a medieval orchard, and trust me, it's not the peaceful, Instagram-worthy fruit garden you're picturing. You're about to discover why tending apple trees in the 1300s was less pastoral poetry, and more, please don't let me die from infected pruning shears. You probably won't survive this, but let's walk through it anyway, because nothing says bedtime like realizing your ancestors lived through absolute chaos just to get a decent pair. So, before you get comfortable, take a moment to like the video and subscribe, but only if you genuinely enjoy what I do here. And hey, drop a comment letting me know where you're listening from and what time it is there. I love seeing this little global community of night owls and insomniacs we've built. Now, dim the lights, maybe turn on a fan for that soft background hum, and let's ease into tonight's journey together. It's barely past 4 in the morning, and you're already awake. Not because you want to be, there's no snooze button in 1347, but because the Rooster 3 cottages over has decided that darkness is merely a suggestion. You peel yourself off a straw mattress that's less mattress and more compressed grass with aspirations, and immediately your back reminds you that lumbar support won't be invented for another 6 centuries. Your feet hit the packed earth floor, and it's cold. So cold. The kind of cold that makes you question every life choice your ancestors made that led to you being born in medieval England instead of, say, a nice Roman villa with underfloor heating. You're an orchard keeper, which sounds lovely until you remember that this job combines the worst aspects of farming, carpentry, amateur botany, and meteorology, all while living under the constant threat of famine. Your orchard, well, technically the Lord's orchard that you tend in exchange for not being kicked off the land, spans about 3 acres of apple, pear, and cherry trees. In a good year, it feeds your family and satisfies your feudal obligations. In a bad year, well, you try not to think about bad years before breakfast. Speaking of breakfast, you're about to eat something that would horrify a modern food safety inspector. You shuffle toward the small fire that your wife somehow kept alive overnight. Keeping fire going is basically a medieval obsession because starting a new one is genuinely difficult. And there's a pot of pottage sitting there. Pottage is the everything soup of medieval peasant life. Yesterday's grain, some onions if you're lucky, maybe a withered turnip, all boiled into a consistency somewhere between oatmeal and regret. You eat it with a wooden spoon that you carved yourself, and it tastes like, well, it tastes like survival. There's no sugar, no salt beyond what you can occasionally trade for, and definitely no coffee to shock your system awake. You're running on carbohydrates, determination, and the vague hope that today won't be the day a branch falls on your head. The pre-dawn light is just starting to leak through the gaps in your cottage walls. And yes, there are gaps, because medieval building standards were more close enough than airtight. You pull on your tunic, which you've been wearing for 3 days straight because you only own 2 and the other one is still drying from when you washed it in the stream last week. Medieval people weren't as universally filthy as pop culture suggests, but let's be real. You smell like work, wood smoke, and unwashed wool. You grab your tools. A pruning knife that your grandfather used, a small handsaw, and a hooked blade for reaching higher branches. These tools are precious. If you break one, you can't just pop down to the hardware store. You'll have to save up to visit the blacksmith, or worse, try to make do with an inferior replacement that makes your work 3 times harder. You step outside, and the world is that particular shade of gray-blue that exists only in the hour before sunrise. Your breath fogs in front of you. It's early April, which means the danger of a late frost is very real, and a late frost means your entire year's fruit crop could be destroyed before the blossoms even set fruit. You can see your orchard stretching out before you, rows of gnarled trees that range from 5 to 50 years old. These aren't the neat, dwarf fruit trees of modern orchards. These are big, unruly things, some of them 20 feet tall, planted with all the irregular spacing of a time before anyone really understood optimal tree density. The first task of your day is inspecting for frost damage. Last night got cold, You could tell by the way the water in your washing bucket had a skin of ice this morning, and you need to see if any of the early blossoms got nipped. You walk slowly down the first row, and your feet are already wet from the dew-soaked grass. Waterproof boots don't exist in your world. You've got leather shoes that you've rubbed with animal fat to make them somewhat water-resistant, but somewhat is doing a lot of heavy lifting in that sentence. By mid-morning, your feet will be damp. By evening, they'll be properly wet. By next week, you'll have that persistent foot fungus that pretty much every medieval peasant just accepted as part of life. You reach the first tree and examine the blossoms. Apples bloom later than cherries. Thank God. But even so, you're always nervous this time of year. The blossoms look okay. A little brown around the edges of a few, but mostly intact. You move to the next tree, then the next, mentally cataloging which varieties seem hardiest. Here's something interesting. Medieval orchard keepers were actually pretty sophisticated about apple varieties. You don't have just one type of apple. You've got early season varieties that ripen in July, mid-season ones for September, and late keepers that you can store through January if you're careful. You've got cookers and eaters, cider apples with high tannins, and sweet dessert varieties that the Lord's family prefers. Historians still argue whether medieval peasants had access to written pomological knowledge, but you don't need books. You've got 30 years of observation and your father's teachings before he died from an infected tooth abscess. As the light improves, you spot your first real problem of the day. One of the older pear trees has a branch that didn't survive the winter. It's dead, not dormant dead. And dead wood is an invitation for disease and pests. You're going to have to prune it, which means climbing, which means risk. Falls from orchard trees are a genuine hazard in your time. There's no emergency room, no antibiotics for infected wounds, no way to properly set a complicated fracture. You know a guy 2 villages over who fell from a plum tree last year and broke his leg badly enough that it healed crooked. He walks with a pronounced limp now and can't do a full day's work, which means his family is perpetually on the edge of destitution. But the branch has to come off, so you position your ladder. A sketchy affair of rough cut wood that wobbles alarmingly, and start climbing. The ladder doesn't reach high enough, so you're going to have to climb onto the branch you're cutting, work your way along it, and make your cut closer to the trunk. This is the kind of thing that would violate about 17 modern safety regulations, but in 1347, this is just called Tuesday. You settle yourself onto a stable-looking branch, wrap your left arm around it for security, and start sawing with your right hand. The saw is dull. It's always dull because sharpening is a skill you're only mediocre at, and the work is slow. Your arm starts burning. Your grip starts slipping. There's a moment where the branch shifts and you think, this is it, this is how I die. But then you catch yourself and keep sawing. When the dead branch finally comes free, it crashes down with a satisfying crack, and you allow yourself a moment of relief. You've completed one task without dying. Medieval victory. You climb down carefully, drag the branch to the edge of the orchard where you're accumulating firewood and fence material, and move on to the next problem. Because there's always a next problem. That's the thing about orchards, they're never done, never finished. There's always something trying to kill your trees, always some task that needs doing, always the pressure of knowing that your survival depends on these plants performing exactly as they need to. You move through the pre-dawn light, checking trees, making mental notes. This one needs summer pruning to open up its center for better air circulation. That one has suspicious mushrooms growing at its base, possible root rot, which could mean the whole tree is on its way out. Another has bark damage, probably from deer during the winter, and you'll need to check if it's girdled the trunk completely, which would be a death sentence for the tree. You've learned to read trees the way others read faces. A healthy tree has a certain stance, a certain color to its leaves, a certain spring in its branches. A struggling tree looks tired somehow, and you can spot that exhaustion from 20 paces. The sun finally breaks the horizon, and the orchard transforms. The light catches the white and pink apple blossoms, and for just a moment, you can see why poets write about orchards. It's genuinely beautiful. But beauty doesn't feed your family, and you've got work to do. You head back toward your cottage because you need to sharpen your knife before you start the day's real work. Grafting. You've got several young rootstocks that you planted 3 years ago, and they're finally thick enough to take grafts from your best producing trees. If you do this right, in 5 years you'll have new trees producing the exact varieties you want. If you do it wrong, you'll have wasted 3 years and the materials, and you'll have to start over. Your wife is up now, dealing with the children and the chickens and the garden and the approximately 73 other things that keep a medieval household functioning. She gives you a look that says, "Try not to bleed on your tunic today," because you have a history of coming back from grafting with minor cuts that she then has to worry about. Infection is always the fear. Always. A cut on your hand can turn red, then painful, then fever-inducing, and then you're having a conversation with the village wise woman about whether to apply a poultice of bread mold or spider webs or whatever folk remedy seems most promising this week. You sit on the bench outside your cottage and begin the meditative work of sharpening your grafting knife. The whetstone is worn smooth from years of use, and you work the blade in careful circles, testing the edge periodically against your thumbnail. Sharp enough to cut paper, they'll say in later centuries, but you don't have paper. You test it against a piece of wood instead, and when it slices through cleanly, you decide you're ready. The morning is properly started now. Birds are singing. Somewhere, someone is shouting at their pig. The church bell rings for prime, reminding everyone that yes, God is watching, and yes, you should probably feel guilty about something. You head back into the orchard with your newly sharpened knife, a ball of twine, and some beeswax for sealing your grafts. You're about to perform plant surgery with medieval technology, and honestly, the trees have about the same survival rate as human patients in this era. Which is to say, not great, but better than you'd think. Let me continue with the grafting section. You approach your rootstock trees, young, vigorous specimens that you've been nursing along specifically for this purpose. The morning dew is still heavy, which is actually ideal because it keeps the plant tissues from drying out while you work. You select your first patient, a 3-year-old rootstock with a nice straight trunk about as thick as your thumb. This is the moment where your entire year of planning either pays off or crumbles. Grafting is genuinely one of those skills that seems like magic when you first learn about it. You're essentially convincing 2 different pieces of tree to become one tree, and it works because plants are way more cooperative about merging their bodies than animals are. But it only works if you do it exactly right. The cambium layers, the living tissue just under the bark, have to line up perfectly. The cut surfaces have to be clean and smooth. The timing has to be right. Too early in spring and the bark won't slip. Too late and the tree won't have enough energy to heal the union. You've been watching your trees for weeks, waiting for that perfect moment when the sap is rising strong, but the leaves haven't fully emerged yet. You've already selected your scion wood, the cutting you're going to graft onto the rootstock. It's a section about as long as your hand, cut from your best apple tree, the one that produces medium-sized fruit with crisp, sweet flesh and keeps well into winter. You took the cutting 6 weeks ago, during the dormant season, and you've been storing it buried in damp sand on the north side of your cottage where it stays cool. The scion is still dormant while the rootstock is waking up, which is exactly what you want. You make your first cut on the rootstock, a smooth, diagonal slice that exposes the white-green cambium beneath the bark. Your knife is sharp enough that the cut is clean, no ragged edges, no crushed cells. Then you make a matching cut on your scion wood. This is where the skill comes in. The cuts need to match so precisely that when you press them together, they look like they were always one piece. You've been doing this for years, and still your hands are tense, your breath held. One shaky movement and you'll have to start over with a fresh cut. And you can only recut so many times before you run out of viable wood. The cuts match. You press them together, adjusting slightly to get the cambium layers aligned on at least one side. It's nearly impossible to align them on both sides unless the rootstock and scion are exactly the same diameter, which they never are. You wrap the union with your twine, firm but not tight enough to crush the tissues. Then comes the beeswax, melted earlier over your fire and kept warm in a small pot. You paint the wax over the entire union, sealing out air and moisture, creating a protective bandage that will let the graft heal without drying out or getting infected by fungal spores. You step back and examine your work. It looks good, but you won't really know for 3 weeks. That's how long it takes for a graft to either take or fail. If it takes, the scion will start growing, pushing out leaves that are genetically identical to its parent tree. If it fails, the scion will just sit there, turn brown, and eventually fall off, and you'll have wasted time and materials and hope. Historians still argue whether medieval grafting success rates were as good as ancient Roman rates. The Romans wrote extensively about pomaculture, then that knowledge was partially lost, then gradually reconstructed through trial and error in monasteries and manor orchards. You don't know the statistics. You just know that more of your grafts succeed than fail, which is good enough. You move to the next rootstock and repeat the process. And the next. And the next. By the time you've finished all 6 grafts you planned for today, the sun is properly up, it's mid-morning, and your back is complaining about all the bending. Your knife needs sharpening again. Your hands are sticky with sap and beeswax. But you've done something genuinely important. You've potentially added 6 productive trees to your orchard, 6 future sources of food and income and insurance against disaster. Because that's what orchards really are in medieval times, insurance. A bad grain harvest can be devastating, but if your fruit trees produce, you've got food. You've got something to trade. You've got cider to drink when the water quality is questionable, and it's frequently questionable. You've got the dried apples and pears that make winter meals less monotonous. You've got the ability to pay your obligations to the Lord without having to give up all your grain. You clean your knife and head toward the stream that runs along one edge of your orchard. You need to wash the sap off your hands, and you want to check the water levels because irrigation is always a concern. The stream is running well. Spring snowmelt from the hills, but you know that by August it'll be a trickle, and you'll be hauling water by hand to keep your younger trees alive through dry spells. You splash the cold water on your face, and it's shocking and perfect, and for a moment you feel almost human again. The morning stretches ahead of you with the peculiar weight of medieval time. No clocks, no schedules, just the sun's position and the endless list of tasks that need doing before darkness falls. You've finished your grafting, which means you've checked off exactly one item from a list that never actually gets shorter. Now comes the maintenance work that separates mediocre orchards from good ones, and good orchards from the kind that keep your family fed through lean years. You walk back through your rows, and this time you're looking at the established trees with a more critical eye. Pruning isn't just a spring activity, though spring is when you do the heavy work. It's an ongoing conversation between you and your trees. You're constantly shaping them, directing their energy, making decisions about which branches stay and which ones go. Modern orchardists have the luxury of research and extension services and YouTube tutorials. You've got observation, tradition, and the occasional piece of advice from the monastery orchard keeper when he's in a talkative mood. The pear tree in front of you is about 15 years old, right in its productive prime, but it's throwing up water sprouts like crazy. Water sprouts are those vigorous, straight-up shoots that emerge from the trunk or main branches, and they're basically the tree's way of saying, I have extra energy and I'm going to waste it on useless growth instead of fruit. You need to remove them, and you need to do it now while they're still young and tender. You grab each sprout and pull it sharply downward and away from the trunk. Most of them come off cleanly, leaving just a small wound that'll heal quickly. The ones that don't pull off easily, you cut with your knife, making the cut as close to flush with the trunk as possible. Here's something they don't tell you in the romantic poems about orchard life. This work is repetitive to the point of meditation or madness, depending on your perspective. You move from tree to tree, pulling sprouts, cutting awkward branches, removing dead wood. Your hands develop a rhythm. Pull, cut, assess, move on. Pull, cut, assess, move on. The sun climbs higher and the air warms, and you start to sweat under your wool tunic because medieval clothing has exactly two temperature settings: freezing or sweating with no comfortable middle ground. By midday, you've worked your way through about half the orchard, and your stomach is reminding you that pottage was many hours ago. You head back to the cottage where your wife has laid out bread. Actual bread, not just pottage, because yesterday was baking day, and some hard cheese that tastes like salted leather but contains protein and fat, and that's what matters. There's also small beer, which is weak enough that it won't get you drunk but strong enough that it's safer than drinking water from questionable sources. You eat quickly, sitting on the bench outside your cottage, watching your children chase a chicken that has no interest in being caught. Medieval lunch breaks aren't really breaks. They're just brief interruptions in work. You're back in the orchard within 20 minutes, and now you're tackling a problem that's been worrying you for weeks. One of your best apple trees has developed a split in a major branch. It happened during a winter storm, and you've been watching it nervously ever since. The split hasn't gotten worse, but it hasn't healed either. And if you don't do something, the entire branch could tear away during the next strong wind, taking a significant portion of your harvest with it. You need to splint it. This is medieval tree surgery, and it's equal parts carpentry and hope. You've brought some straight wooden stakes that you carved during the winter when outdoor work was impossible, and you've got more of that twine and some strips of leather. You climb up into the tree, more terrifying ladder work, and position yourself so you can work on the split. First, you need to draw the split closed, which means pulling the branch back into its original position. This requires strength and careful balance because you're essentially wrestling with a tree while perched 15 feet in the air on branches that are, themselves, flexible and unstable. You loop your leather strap around the branch above the split and pull, using your body weight as leverage. The split closes, you can see the torn wood fibers aligning again, and you hold it there while you position your first splint. You tie it tight with twine, then add a second splint on the opposite side, then a third for good measure. When you're done, the branch is armored in wood and leather and hope, and you've done everything you can. Whether it heals or tears away during the next storm is now between the tree and God, and you're honestly not sure which one you trust more with this particular decision. You climb down carefully. Falling is still a fear every single time, and move on to your next concern. Several of your younger trees need training. Training is the process of shaping a young tree into a productive form, and it starts from the moment you plant them. You want trees with strong central leaders or well-balanced open centers, depending on the species and variety. You want scaffolding branches that emerge at good angles, not too steep, not too horizontal, spaced evenly around the trunk. You definitely don't want branches that form narrow crotch angles because those are weak points where splits will develop as the tree matures and bears heavy crops. The 5-year-old apple tree in front of you has decided to grow 3 competing leaders instead of one strong central trunk, which is exactly the kind of poor life choice that trees make when you're not paying attention. You need to choose which leader stays and remove the other 2. This feels weirdly consequential, like you're playing God with the tree's entire future structure. You examine each leader, looking at its angle, its vigor, its position relative to the rest of the tree. You choose the most vertical one, the one that's best aligned with the trunk below it. The other 2 have to go. You make your cuts carefully using your sharpest pruning angle. You cut just above a bud that's pointing in the direction you want future growth to go, and you angle the cut so water will run off rather than pooling and inviting rot. These are details that seem minor until you've seen trees decline and die from accumulated poor pruning decisions. Every cut is a wound, and wounds can become infection sites, and infections can kill trees. You're trying to minimize damage while shaping future productivity, And honestly, the mental calculation involved is more complex than most people imagine when they picture lazy orchard keepers napping under apple trees. Historians still argue whether medieval orchardists understood plant physiology in any systematic way, or whether they were just working from accumulated trial-and-error wisdom. You don't think about it in those terms. You just know what works because your father showed you and his father showed him. You know that cuts heal better during certain times of year. You know that some trees respond to hard pruning by throwing up lots of new growth, while others sulk and barely grow at all. You know that fruit production and vegetative growth are in constant competition. Heavy pruning encourages leafy growth, light pruning encourages fruiting, and you're always trying to find the balance that gives you healthy trees that also produce enough fruit to justify their existence. The afternoon wears on, and you're now dealing with a problem that's part horticulture and part politics. Your cherry trees are encroaching on the boundary between your orchard and your neighbor's field. The neighbor, a perpetually irritated man named Edmund who seems to believe that everyone is conspiring against him personally, has complained that your cherry branches are hanging over his land and dropping fruit onto his crops. He wants you to cut them back. You want to tell him that a few cherries falling onto his turnips aren't going to destroy his harvest, but medieval neighbor relations are delicate things, and you have to live next to this man for the rest of your life, so compromise is necessary. You grab your saw and climb into the cherry tree, which is messier work than apple pruning because cherry sap is sticky and gets everywhere. You start removing branches that cross the boundary, but you're strategic about it. You cut back enough to satisfy Edmund's complaints, but not so much that you're sacrificing significant fruit production. Each cut you make is mentally calculated. How much fruit am I losing? How much will this tree compensate by redirecting energy to other branches? How annoyed will Edmund be if I leave this one branch that's only slightly over the boundary? Cherry trees also bleed sap more than apples or pears, and you have to be careful about when you prune them. You're technically doing this slightly too early in the season. The ideal time is late spring or summer when the sap flow has slowed, but Edmund's complaining has reached a volume that requires immediate response. You make each cut as clean as possible and hope the tree won't punish you too badly for the timing. Trees can be vindictive in their way. Mistreat them and they'll decline, refusing to fruit properly, dropping leaves early, becoming susceptible to every pest and disease that comes along. You're not sure if this is intentional on the tree's part or just how stress plants behave, but the result is the same. When you're done with Edmund's boundary trees, you're covered in cherry sap and tree debris, and the sun is starting its descent toward evening. Your body is tired in that deep, muscle-level way that comes from hours of physical labor interspersed with moments of intense concentration. But you're not done yet because orchards are never done. You walk the rows one more time, doing a final check, looking for problems you might have missed earlier. You find one. A young pear tree has bark damage at its base, and when you investigate, you discover vole tunnels. Voles, small rodents that live in underground burrow systems, love to gnaw on tree bark during winter when other food is scarce. If they girdle the trunk completely, removing bark all the way around the circumference, the tree will die because it can't transport nutrients between roots and branches. This tree isn't fully girdled yet, but it's close. You need to protect it. You head to your tool shed, a lean-to structure that's barely holding together, and grab some scrap metal and wire. You're going to create a physical barrier around the base of the tree to prevent further vole damage. You wrap the metal around the trunk, leaving a bit of space so it doesn't constrict the tree as it grows, and secure it with wire. It's ugly and improvised, but it'll work. Function over aesthetics is basically the medieval motto for everything. By the time you finish, the light is fading into that golden pre-sunset phase, and you realize you've been working for nearly 12 hours with only a brief lunch break. This is normal. This is every day during growing season. The romantic notion of pastoral agricultural life conveniently ignores the fact that it's relentless, physically demanding work with no weekends, no vacation days, and no retirement plan beyond hopefully your children will take care of you when you're too broken down to work anymore. You clean your tools, even when you're exhausted, you clean your tools because tools are expensive and irreplaceable, and rust is the enemy, and store them in your shed. Your pruning knife gets wiped down with an oily rag. Your saw gets hung on its designated peg. Your twine gets coiled properly so it won't tangle. These small acts of maintenance are how you prevent bigger problems later, and you've learned this lesson the hard way multiple times. As you walk back toward your cottage, you do a mental inventory of tomorrow's tasks. You need to check those graphs again, even though they won't show signs of success or failure for another couple weeks. You need to start thinking about pest control because spring warmth means insects are waking up. You need to repair a section of fence that's falling apart. You need to spread the manure you've been collecting all winter around the base of your trees because medieval fertilizer is just animal poop, and if you want productive trees, you need to feed them. The list is endless, and it'll still be endless when you die and your son takes over this orchard, and then when his son takes over after that. But for now, as the sun sets and the air cools and your children's voices drift from the cottage where your wife is serving dinner, you allow yourself a moment of something that might be satisfaction. The grafts are done. The pruning is done, or at least today's pruning is done. The trees are still alive, still standing, still preparing to bloom and fruit and keep your family fed for another year. In medieval terms, that's a victory, not a dramatic one. Not the kind that gets written about in chronicles, but the small, grinding, everyday victory of survival through competent work. You'll eat dinner, more pottage probably, because pottage is eternal, and then you'll collapse onto your straw mattress and sleep the heavy, dreamless sleep of physical exhaustion. And tomorrow you'll wake up before dawn and do it all again, because that's what orchard keeping is. The same essential tasks repeated endlessly with slight variations across seasons and years and generations, all in service of coaxing fruit from trees that would honestly rather be wild in a forest somewhere, unbothered by your constant interventions and improvements. You wake to the sound of something eating your orchard, which is a sentence that would sound paranoid in any other context but is just accurate when you're a medieval fruit grower. It's early May now, about 3 weeks after your grafting session, and the trees have leafed out beautifully, which means every insect within a 5-mile radius has decided that your orchard is an all-you-can-eat buffet. You stumble outside in the pre-dawn gray, and even in the dim light you can see the damage. Irregular holes in leaves, entire leaves stripped to their veins, and the telltale frass, insect droppings, scattered across branches like tiny accusations of your inadequacy as a protector of trees. The primary culprits are caterpillars, because of course they are. Spring caterpillars are the bane of every orchardist's existence, and they come in multiple varieties, each with their own preferred destruction method. You've got the winter moth caterpillars that emerged from eggs laid last fall, now busily eating their way through your apple blossoms and young leaves. You've got the green oak tortrix caterpillars that roll themselves up in leaves like tiny sleeping bags and eat from the inside. You've got the codling moth larvae that will, later in the season, bore directly into your developing fruit and ruin it from within. Right now, in early May, you're mainly dealing with the leaf eaters, and there are thousands of them. Modern orchards have pesticides, integrated pest management programs, and pheromone traps. You have your hands and prayers and a few folk remedies of dubious effectiveness. You start with the most labor-intensive method, hand-picking. You move through your trees systematically, examining every branch you can reach, plucking off caterpillars one by one and crushing them between your fingers. It's disgusting work. The caterpillars squish with a soft pop, releasing green goo that stains your hands and smells faintly of digested plant matter. Some of them are hairy and leave irritating bristles in your skin. Others are smooth and disturbingly fat, bloated with stolen leaf tissue. You've been doing this for about an hour when you notice your neighbor. Not Edmund the perpetually angry, but Thomas from the other side, is watching you with an expression of amusement. Still picking them off by hand? he calls over. You should try the smoke method. The smoke method involves burning specific herbs and green wood under your trees, creating a smoke that supposedly repels insects. You've tried it before. It works about as well as you'd expect burning some rosemary and hoping for the best would work, which is to say, not very. But Thomas swears by it, and you've learned that arguing about pest control methods with other medieval farmers is pointless because everyone has their preferred superstitions and no one has actual data. I'll stick with this. You call back, holding up a particularly fat caterpillar before crushing it. Thomas shrugs and goes back to his own problems, which probably involve different but equally frustrating pests. Here's the thing about medieval agriculture. You're all struggling with the same basic problems, but information sharing is limited to casual conversation and observation, so everyone reinvents slightly different solutions, most of which are marginally effective at best. Historians still argue whether medieval farmers were sophisticated empiricists or just stumbling through trial and error, but from your perspective, you're doing your best with limited options and no understanding of insect life cycles beyond small things eat my trees and I hate them. After 3 hours of hand-picking, your back is screaming, your fingers are cramped, and you've barely made a dent in the caterpillar population. You need a different approach. You head back to your cottage and mix up a bucket of what you optimistically call pest spray, but which is really just water with crushed garlic, some bitter herbs, and wood ash stirred in. You have no idea if this works. Your father used it. His father used it. It might do something, or it might just be theater to make you feel like you're taking action. You dip a rag in the mixture and start wiping down leaves and branches, focusing on the areas with the heaviest insect activity. The smell is potent. Garlic and ash and plant bitterness all mixed together, and it makes your eyes water. If nothing else, it's making you miserable, so maybe it's making the insects miserable too. That's the logic, anyway. You work your way through several trees, and by the time you're done, you're covered in the spray, you smell like a walking salad gone wrong, and you have no confidence that you've actually solved anything. But you've done something which is psychologically important when you're facing problems that feel overwhelming and endless. Just when you think you've addressed the caterpillar situation as well as you can, you discover a new problem: aphids. Tiny green aphids are clustered on the tender new growth at the branch tips, sucking sap and coating everything in sticky honeydew. Where there are aphids, there will soon be ants farming them like livestock, and sooty mold growing on the honeydew, and leaves curling and distorting. You can't handpick aphids, there are too many, and they're too small. Your garlic spray might help, or it might not. What you really need are ladybugs, which eat aphids voraciously, but you can't exactly order beneficial insects from a catalog in 1347. So you do the only thing you can: you blast them with water. You haul bucket after bucket from the stream and literally throw water at the affected branches, trying to knock the aphids off with water pressure. Some of them wash away. Most of them probably don't. You're essentially trying to win a war of attrition against organisms that reproduce faster than you can count, and you're losing, but you can't afford to stop trying because if the aphid population explodes unchecked, your trees will be weakened just as they're trying to set fruit. Between the caterpillars and the aphids and the general anxiety about what other pests are lurking and preparing to strike, you almost don't notice that birds are also becoming a problem. Almost. But then you catch a flock of sparrows absolutely demolishing the cherry blossoms on your best cherry tree, and you realize you have yet another front in this endless war. Birds love fruit, obviously, but they also eat blossoms and developing fruit and will basically steal anything they can from your orchard given the opportunity. You try scarecrows. You've got one already, a rough human shape made of sticks and stuffed with straw, wearing an old tunic that's too tattered even for you to wear anymore. It worked for about 3 days when you first put it up, and now the birds literally perch on its arms while they eat your cherries. Birds, it turns out, are smarter than medieval pest control methods. You try tying strips of cloth to branches so they flutter in the wind and supposedly scare birds away. This works for maybe a day. You try hanging up old pots and pans that clank together in the breeze. The birds ignore them after the initial surprise. What actually works, is being present. Birds are wary of humans, so when you're working in the orchard, they mostly stay away. But you can't be in the orchard every minute of every day, and the moment you leave, they descend like a feathered plague. You consider getting a cat, but cats are surprisingly expensive to maintain, and besides, cats hunt birds sometimes, but also spend a lot of time napping in sunbeams and ignoring your pest problems. Some orchardists swear by trained dogs that bark at birds, but training dogs is its own time investment, and you're already stretched thin. The most frustrating part is that birds aren't entirely bad. They eat insects too, including some of the caterpillars that are eating your leaves. So you're caught in this uncomfortable ecological reality where your enemies are also sometimes your allies, and you can't eliminate them without making other problems worse. Medieval pest management is all about these kinds of impossible trade-offs and compromises where there are no perfect solutions, only choices between different types of damage. And then there's the mammals. Oh, the mammals. Deer would love nothing more than to browse your young trees and bark, especially in winter when food is scarce. You've fenced your orchard, but medieval fences are permeable barriers at best. Gaps develop, posts rot, and deer are determined. You've wrapped the trunks of your youngest trees with thorny brambles to discourage nibbling, but this only works if you maintain it, and maintenance is just another item on the endless task list. Rabbits are smaller but no less destructive. They'll gnaw on bark, especially of young trees, and they can do serious damage quickly. You've set snares around your orchard perimeter, partly for pest control and partly because rabbit stew is a welcome addition to your diet. You check your snares each morning, and about once a week you actually catch something. The rabbit gets eaten, and its skin gets added to your slowly growing collection of pelts that you'll eventually trade to someone who knows how to tan leather properly. Then there are voles, remember the voles from yesterday? And mice, and even the occasional badger that digs up roots while hunting for grubs. Every single one of these creatures sees your orchard as a resource to exploit, and you see them as threats to your survival. It's not personal. The deer aren't trying to starve you specifically, but the end result is the same. They eat your trees produce less fruit, and you have less food and less surplus to trade. By mid-morning, you're exhausted from fighting a multi-front war against the entire animal kingdom, and you haven't even addressed the livestock problem yet. Your neighbor Edmund keeps sheep, and sheep are escape artists with a death wish and a hunger for anything green. Last week, 3 of his sheep got through a gap in the hedge between your properties and spent several hours eating your orchard grass and rubbing against your trees and generally being destructive in the way that only sheep can be. You chased them out and told Edmund to fix his fence, and he promised he would, but you notice the gap is still there. This is the kind of low-level, ongoing conflict that defines medieval rural life. You can't afford to escalate to a serious feud because you need to maintain working relationships with your neighbors. You share tools, help each other during harvest, and generally depend on the community for survival. But you also can't let his livestock destroy your livelihood. So you walk over to the gap in the hedge and spend an hour weaving cut branches into it, creating a thicker barrier. It's not your responsibility, technically, but it's faster than waiting for Edmund to get around to it. And every day of delay is another opportunity for sheep-based disasters. While you're working on the hedge, you notice that someone else's chickens, you're not even sure whose, are scratching around under your apple trees. Chickens are complicated. On one hand, they eat fallen fruit, which can harbor pests and diseases, and they eat insects and grubs, which is helpful. On the other hand, they scratch up the soil around tree roots, they peck at low-hanging fruit, and their manure is so hot with nitrogen that too much of it in one spot can actually burn plants. You chase these chickens out, not because they're causing immediate damage, but because you're in a bad mood about pests in general. Back to the insect situation. By afternoon, you've noticed that your cherry trees are hosting black fly colonies. Tiny black aphids that cluster on shoot tips and under leaves. Black flies on cherries are particularly annoying because they curl the leaves tightly around themselves, creating protective shelters that make them hard to wash off or spray. You try anyway, using your garlic ash spray and a lot of frustrated scrubbing with a rag, but you know you're only getting a fraction of them. The rest will keep reproducing and spreading, and by June your cherry trees will look distressed and stunted. And there's not much you can do about it with 14th century technology. You also spot the first signs of sawfly larvae on your pears. Sawflies look like caterpillars but are actually wasp relatives, and their larvae skeletonize leaves, eating everything except the major veins. You've learned to recognize the damage pattern. Leaves that look like lace, dried and brown between the veins. You start handpicking these too, adding them to your mental catalog of things trying to kill my trees this week. The pest pressure is relentless, and what makes it particularly demoralizing is that you're fighting blind. You don't understand insect life cycles. You don't know that the moth you see fluttering around your trees in the evening will lay eggs that become the caterpillars eating your leaves 3 weeks later. You don't know that the aphids are reproducing asexually and parthenogenetically, creating endless clones without needing to mate. You don't know that many of your pest problems could be reduced with better timing of interventions or by encouraging natural predators. You just know that every spring and summer your trees get eaten, and all you can do is fight back with crude methods and hope you save enough of the crop to make it through another year. By evening, you're sitting outside your cottage, exhausted and discouraged, picking caterpillar guts out from under your fingernails. Your wife brings you dinner, a stew this time, with actual vegetables from the garden and a bit of dried meat, and you eat mechanically while staring at your orchard. From this distance, in the soft evening light, it looks peaceful, beautiful even. You can't see the insect damage or the half-eaten leaves or the aphid colonies. You just see trees green and growing, preparing to feed your family. Tomorrow you'll get up and fight the same battles again. And the day after that. And the day after that. Because that's what pest management is in the medieval period. A daily grind of manual labor and improvised solutions and small victories that never quite add up to winning the war, only to surviving long enough to fight again the next season. You're not protecting your orchard from pests. That's impossible. You're just reducing the damage to levels that allow the trees to survive and produce enough fruit to justify their existence. It's a low bar, but it's your bar, and you'll spend the entire growing season trying to clear it. The stream that runs along the eastern edge of your orchard is the difference between survival and disaster. And right now, in the 3rd week of May, it's running strong with late spring rains. You stand at its bank in the early morning watching the water flow, and you're doing calculations that are part hydrology, part politics, and part prayer. Your trees need water, obviously, but so do everyone else's crops, and the stream doesn't belong to you. It belongs to the Lord, technically, which means it belongs to everyone and no one, which means its use is governed by a complicated web of customs, agreements, and simmering resentments that occasionally explode into actual violence. Upstream from you is the miller, whose mill will requires consistent water flow to grind grain. He's got priority water rights because milling is essential, and also because he's been here longer than you and has the Lord's explicit protection. Downstream from you are 3 other families with fields and gardens that need irrigation. Between you and them is a delicate balance where everyone is theoretically entitled to reasonable use, but reasonable is interpreted differently by everyone involved. You've seen neighbors come to blows over water rights. You've seen fields deliberately flooded to spite a rival. You've seen people divert streams in the night and pretend innocence in the morning. Your orchard is actually in a decent position, hydrologically speaking. You're close enough to the stream that you can gravity feed water to your trees without too much labor, and you're far enough from the mill that you're not competing directly with its water needs. But that doesn't mean irrigation is simple. Far from it. You need to get water from the stream to your trees, which means digging channels, maintaining berms, preventing erosion, and doing all of this in a way that doesn't anger your downstream neighbors by taking more than your share. You've spent years developing your irrigation system, which is generous language for a series of shallow ditches that sometimes work. The main channel runs from the stream into your orchard, following the natural slope of the land. From this main channel, smaller ditches branch off to individual tree rows. In theory, you can open and close these branches with small wooden gates, directing water where it's needed most. In practice, the ditches constantly fill with silt and leaves, the gates rot and break, and the whole system requires more maintenance than you'd like to admit. Today's job is clearing the main channel, which you haven't done since early spring and which is now half full of accumulated debris. You grab a wooden shovel. Metal shovels exist but are expensive, so wood is what you've got, and start the muddy work of scooping out silt. It's disgusting labor. The bottom of the ditch is slippery and smells like decomposition. Your feet sink into the muck. Leeches are a possibility, though you haven't seen any yet this season. You work slowly upstream, piling the muck on the sides of the ditch where it'll dry out and eventually get spread as fertilizer because waste not, want not. After an hour, you've cleared maybe 20 feet of channel, and you've got hundreds of feet to go. This is going to be an all-day job, possibly a 2-day job if you're being realistic. You keep shoveling, and your mind wanders to the bigger water problem looming in your future. Summer drought. Right now, in May, water is abundant. But by July and August, the stream will be a fraction of its current volume, and every orchard keeper and farmer in the area will be desperate for irrigation. That's when the conflicts really heat up. Last summer, you had a serious argument with John, whose field is downstream from you. He claimed you were taking more than your fair share from the stream, leaving insufficient water for his barley. You claimed he was exaggerating and that his real problem was poor soil management. The argument escalated. Voices were raised. Threats were made. Eventually, the village reeve, a sort of elected foreman who settles disputes, had to intervene and broker a compromise where you agreed to limit your water use to early morning and late evening, leaving midday flow for downstream users. You hated the compromise because it meant hauling water during the hottest parts of the day, but you accepted it because the alternative was ongoing feud that might eventually involve damaged property or worse. Medieval water rights are a fascinating and frustrating mix of common law, tradition, and might makes right. Historians still argue whether these systems were generally fair and sustainable or exploitative and prone to collapse. From your ground-level perspective, the system works well enough most of the time and breaks down completely during drought years. Everyone remembers the summer of 1343 when the stream nearly dried up completely and people were hauling water in buckets from wells 3 miles away. Trees died that year. Crops failed. Families went hungry. You're determined not to repeat that experience, which means being strategic about water use now, while water is available. You finish clearing the main channel by mid-afternoon, and immediately you notice a problem. The flow from the stream into your channel is weak. You investigate and discover that upstream, near the miller's property, someone has partially blocked the stream with rocks and debris, redirecting more water to the mill race. This might be intentional sabotage, or it might be natural accumulation that the miller hasn't bothered to clear because it benefits him. Either way, it's reducing your water access and you need to address it. You walk upstream to the miller's property, trying to decide how to handle this diplomatically. The miller, a gruff man named Robert who always seems to have flour dust in his beard, is outside his mill working on the wheel mechanism. You approach carefully because you've learned that direct accusations rarely go well. "Robert," you say, "seems like there's some debris blocking the stream up there near your intake, probably washed down during the last storm. Mind if I clear it?" Robert looks at you with the expression of a man who knows exactly what you're really saying. "Stream seems fine to me," he replies. "Mill's running well. Don't see a problem. This is the dance." He's not going to admit that the blockage might be intentional, and you're not going to directly accuse him. Instead, you're going to negotiate around the edges. Right, you say. I'm sure it's fine for the mill, but downstream flow is a bit low, and you know how people get about water rights. Figured I'd clear it before anyone gets upset. Save us all some trouble. Robert considers this. He's not a bad person, just someone who's protecting his interests the same way you're protecting yours. I suppose it wouldn't hurt to clear some of that debris, he finally says. But don't mess with the mill race. That stays as is. You agree because you're getting most of what you want, and you spend the next hour removing rocks and branches from the stream, restoring something closer to natural flow. Robert watches you work with his arms crossed, making sure you don't do anything that might reduce his water supply. It's all very passive-aggressive and very medieval. With the stream flow improved, you head back to your orchard and open the gates to let water flow through your channels. This is immensely satisfying. Watching water spread through your system, seeing it reach the base of your trees, knowing you're providing the moisture they need for fruit development. But it's also nerve-wracking because you're hyper-aware that downstream neighbors are probably watching their water supply, ready to complain if they think you're taking too much. You let the water run for 2 hours, focusing on your younger trees that need more consistent moisture. Established trees can handle some drought stress, but trees that are 3 to 5 years old are vulnerable. You've lost young trees to drought before, and each loss represents years of investment gone to waste. So you prioritize them, making sure each one gets a good soaking. While the water runs, you turn your attention to another water-related problem: standing water. There's a low spot in your orchard where water collects after heavy rains, and the soil there stays soggy. This is a problem because fruit trees, especially apples and pears, hate having wet feet. Constantly soggy soil leads to root rot, which is exactly as bad as it sounds. Roots literally rot away, unable to absorb nutrients or water, and the tree slowly declines and dies over the course of months or years. You've been fighting this low spot for years. You've tried building up the soil with manure and compost, creating a raised area where tree roots can stay above the soggy zone. You've tried digging drainage channels to route water away. Nothing has worked perfectly because you're fighting the fundamental topography of the land with hand tools and limited time. The tree in the soggy spot, a pear tree that's about 8 years old, looks stressed. Its leaves are yellowing in a pattern that suggests nutrient deficiency, probably because its roots are struggling. You're going to lose this tree eventually unless you do something more drastic. The drastic solution would be to dig a serious drainage ditch, maybe 3 feet deep, running from the low spot to the stream. This would effectively drain the area and solve the problem permanently. But it would be days of brutal labor digging through heavy clay soil, and you'd have to coordinate with neighbors to make sure your drainage doesn't flood someone else's property. It's one of those projects that you know you should do but keep postponing because the immediate return doesn't justify the enormous effort. So instead, you do half measures. You dig shallow channels, you pile up more soil, you prune the struggling tree lightly to reduce stress, and you hope it survives long enough for you to get around to the real solution. By late afternoon, you close the gates on your irrigation channels and let the remaining water flow downstream. You've used what you judge to be your fair share, maybe slightly more than fair, but not so much that anyone will complain loudly. This is the constant calculation. Take enough water to keep your trees healthy, but not so much that you trigger conflicts with neighbors. Push the boundaries, but don't break them. As the sun starts its descent, you walk your orchard one more time, checking soil moisture by feel. You dig your fingers into the soil at the base of several trees, gauging how deeply the water has penetrated. Good irrigation should wet the soil to a depth of at least 2 feet, reaching most of the active root zone. Surface watering, just wetting the top few inches, is almost worse than no watering at all because it encourages shallow root growth, making trees more vulnerable to drought. You're pleased to find that most of your trees have good moisture penetration, though a few on higher ground need more attention tomorrow. There's another water problem you're anticipating but can't do much about yet. Fungal diseases encouraged by moisture. Your irrigation is necessary, but it also creates humidity and leaf wetness that promote apple scab, pear leaf spot, and various other fungal infections. These diseases won't become obvious for another few weeks, but they're probably already germinating, spores landing on wet leaves and starting their infectious cycles. You'll deal with them when symptoms appear, using your limited tools. Removing infected leaves, improving air circulation through pruning, and hoping for dry weather. Medieval disease management is reactive, not preventive, because you don't have fungicides or even a clear understanding of what causes these diseases in the first place. As evening settles, you sit by the stream, feet aching, hands cramped from hours of shovel work. The water flows past you, heading downstream to John's Field and beyond, eventually reaching the river and then the sea, though you've never seen the sea and probably never will. You're just one user among many, all of you depending on this single stream that originates somewhere in the hills and flows through your lives, essential and contentious and never entirely under anyone's control. Tomorrow the stream will still be flowing, and you'll have to check your channels again, clear new blockages, watch for upstream interference, and continue the endless management of water resources that keeps your orchard alive. It's exhausting, but right now, with the sound of flowing water and the evening birds and the cooling air, you can almost pretend it's peaceful. Almost. It's late June now, and you've been watching your fruit develop for weeks with the kind of obsessive attention that other people reserve for newborn children. The tiny green knobs that appeared after successful pollination have swollen into recognizable fruit. Apples the size of walnuts, pears slightly larger, cherries already approaching full size because cherries mature faster than anything else in your orchard. This is simultaneously the most hopeful and most anxiety-inducing time of year, because you can see your potential harvest taking shape, but you're also acutely aware of the thousand things that could still go wrong. The first disaster appears on a morning that starts perfectly normal. You're doing your routine inspection, walking the rows with your eyes scanning for problems, when you notice that the ground under one of your best apple trees is littered with small, immature fruit. You look up and see that the tree has dropped maybe a quarter of its developing apples overnight. This is June drop, a natural phenomenon where trees abort some of their fruit to balance the crop load with their available resources. Some June drop is normal, even desirable, because it thins the crop and allows the remaining fruit to grow larger. But this seems excessive, and you're immediately worried that it indicates a problem, water stress, nutrient deficiency, or pest damage you haven't noticed yet. You examine the dropped fruit carefully. Some of it shows the telltale entry holes of codling moth larvae, tiny caterpillars that bore into the fruit and eat it from the inside. Once they're inside, there's nothing you can do to save that fruit. The apple will be wormy and inedible, fit only for the pigs if you had pigs, or for leaving on the ground where it'll rot and potentially harbor more pests. You crush each dropped apple under your heel, making sure to kill any larvae inside, and add codling moth management to your mental list of losing battles you're fighting this season. But the June drop isn't just about codling moths. You notice that many of the dropped apples don't show pest damage. They're just small and underdeveloped, shed by the tree as part of its natural load management. The tree, in its wisdom, has decided it was trying to mature too many apples and has voluntarily aborted the extras. This is probably good for the final harvest quality, but it's still nerve-wracking to watch potential food fall to the ground. What makes this time of year particularly stressful is that you're in a race against multiple threats, all of which are trying to steal your harvest before you can pick it. There are the insects, codling moths, apple maggots, various beetles, all trying to eat or lay eggs in your developing fruit. There are the birds, which are getting bolder as the cherries ripen and start showing color. There are fungal diseases that can rot fruit on the tree or in storage. There's weather. Hail can destroy an entire crop in minutes. Strong winds can knock fruit off prematurely. Too much rain can cause fruit to split, and drought can stunt development. And then there are human thieves. This is a reality that nobody talks about in the romantic versions of medieval agriculture, but fruit theft is a genuine problem. Your orchard is visible from the road, and travelers passing through sometimes help themselves to fruit, especially once it starts ripening. Local kids sneak into orchards on dares or out of hunger or just because stealing apples is a time-honored tradition. Even some of your neighbors, the ones whose own trees are having poor years, might be tempted to supplement their harvest with some of yours when you're not looking. You can't watch your orchard 24 hours a day, but you do your best. You sleep lightly during harvest season, ear-trained for unusual sounds. You walk the perimeter regularly, making your presence known. You've even slept outside on a few nights when theft seemed particularly likely, wrapping yourself in a blanket under the stars and trying to convince yourself this is pleasant rather than miserable. Medieval property protection is an exhausting personal affair. Your cherry trees are the first to approach harvest ripeness, and this creates an immediate crisis. Cherries ripen fast. Once they start coloring up, you've got maybe a week before they're past prime, and they're intensely attractive to birds. You've tried your various bird-scaring methods, and they've all failed spectacularly. The birds are winning. You watch them land in your cherry trees in flocks, systematically working their way through the ripening fruit, and there's almost nothing you can do about it. Almost nothing, but not quite nothing. You resort to the most labor-intensive bird control method available, human presence. For 3 days straight, from dawn until dusk, either you or your wife or your oldest child stays in or near the orchard, making noise and chasing birds away. You clap your hands, you shout, you throw small stones, not at the birds, just near them. You're trying to scare, not injure. And you generally make yourself annoying enough that the birds decide easier meals are available elsewhere. This works, sort of, but it's exhausting and it takes you away from all the other tasks that need doing. When the cherries hit peak ripeness, you spend 2 frantic days picking. Cherry picking is time-sensitive and physically demanding. You're up on ladders, reaching into tree canopies, trying to pick fruit that's ripe but not overripe, firm but not hard, sweet but not starting to ferment. You quickly learn to identify the perfect cherry by feel, a certain firmness, a certain slip when you twist it gently from the stem. Pick too early and the cherries are sour and won't ripen further. Pick too late and they're mushy and starting to rot on the tree. You fill basket after basket with cherries. Your fingers are stained purple-red from juice. Your arms ache from reaching overhead. You're moving as fast as you can because every cherry you don't pick today might be gone tomorrow. Eaten by birds, dropped from the tree, or fermented into inedibility by the summer heat. Your wife is already processing the cherries you've picked, spreading some to dry in the sun, pitting others to cook into preserves, and setting aside the best ones for immediate eating or trading. Medieval cherry preservation is tricky because cherries are so perishable. Without refrigeration, you've got limited options. Drying works if the weather cooperates. You spread the cherries on wooden frames covered with cloth, set them in full sun, and hope it doesn't rain. If it does rain, the partially dried cherries can mold and you lose the batch. Cooking into preserves requires honey or precious sugar if you can afford it, plus hours of stirring over the fire. Some cherries you'll try to preserve in sealed clay pots with honey, creating a sort of primitive compote. Most of them you'll eat fresh or trade to neighbors for things you need. The entire cherry harvest, from first ripe fruit to last, takes about 10 days, and by the end you're sick of cherries, which is saying something because during most of the year you'd love to have cherries available. But you've eaten cherries for breakfast, lunch, and dinner. You've eaten them fresh, dried, and cooked. You've traded them until your neighbors are also sick of cherries. And you're profoundly relieved when the cherry season ends and you can turn your attention to the apples and pears that are still developing. Except you can't fully turn your attention away from cherries, because now comes the post-harvest reckoning. You need to assess how much of your crop you actually managed to harvest versus how much you lost to birds, weather, pests, and theft. You walk your cherry trees and see the evidence of imperfect protection. Branches still heavy with unpicked fruit that's now overripe and rotting, attracting wasps and beetles. Fruit on the ground being eaten by insects and small mammals. The financial and caloric calculation is depressing. You probably lost 30 to 40% of your potential cherry harvest to various factors beyond your control. But there's no time to mourn lost cherries because your apples are entering a critical phase. They're still green and hard, about halfway to maturity, and they're starting to show signs of insect damage that's been accumulating over the past month. You do another inspection and find codling moth damage in about 1 apple in 10. Small entry holes, often with frass visible, indicating a larva is inside eating its way through the flesh. Each damaged apple represents a loss, but it also represents a future pest problem because the larvae will eventually leave the apple, pupate somewhere in your orchard, and emerge as moths that will lay eggs and start the cycle again. You start culling the obviously damaged fruit, picking it off trees and destroying it before the larvae can complete their life cycle. This is heartbreaking work because you're voluntarily reducing your harvest, throwing away food that might have been barely edible, all to prevent worse infestations next year. Historians still argue whether medieval orchardists understood pest life cycles well enough to practice sanitation like this, but you don't need to understand the details. You just know from observation that removing damaged fruit early reduces problems later. The midsummer heat is also creating new challenges. Several of your pear trees are showing signs of fire blight, a bacterial disease that makes branches look scorched, as if they've been burned. Infected shoots turn black and curl into distinctive shepherd's crooks, and the disease can spread rapidly through the tree if you don't act fast. You grab your pruning knife, disinfect it by heating it in the fire. You don't know why this helps, but tradition says hot metal prevents disease spread, and you're not going to argue with tradition when you're desperate and start cutting out infected branches. Each cut has to be made well below the visible infection, at least a foot back into healthy wood, because the bacteria spread through the tree's vascular system ahead of visible symptoms. You're essentially amputating branches to save the tree, and you're doing it frantically because fire blight can kill a mature pear tree in a single season if it reaches the main trunk. After each cut, you heat your knife again before moving to the next cut, trying to avoid spreading the bacteria from tree to tree on your tools. The infected branches go into a pile that you'll burn later, because leaving them lying around is just asking for the disease to spread. By late afternoon, you've removed about 15% of your pear tree canopy, and you're exhausted and worried. The trees look butchered, unbalanced, but they're hopefully saved from total collapse. You won't know for weeks whether you caught the infection in time. Meanwhile, the remaining fruit on those trees is still developing, still demanding water and nutrients, still vulnerable to all the other problems that haven't gone away just because you were dealing with fire blight. As you're cleaning up the pile of infected branches for burning, you notice storm clouds building in the west. Summer storms are common, but they're also terrifying for orchardists because of the hail risk. A single hailstorm can scar every fruit in your orchard, rendering it unmarketable and more vulnerable to rot. Worse, it can strip leaves and break branches, weakening trees for years to come. You watch the clouds nervously, trying to judge whether this is just a rain system or whether you need to prepare for the worst. The storm arrives with less violence than you feared. Heavy rain, some wind, but no hail. You stand in your doorway watching water pour off your thatch roof, and you're doing two simultaneous calculations. Relief that there's no hail, and worry about whether this much rain will cause your developing apples to split from taking up water too quickly. Split fruit is lost fruit, the cracks provide entry points for fungi and insects, and the flesh starts rotting within days. You'll know by tomorrow morning if you've got a splitting problem, and there's absolutely nothing you can do about it now except watch the rain and hope. The rain stops after an hour, and you go out immediately to assess damage. The orchard is dripping, leaves sparkling with water droplets in the late-day sun. You examine your apples carefully and find minimal splitting, maybe 5% of fruit showing small cracks, which is actually pretty good. You mark those trees mentally for early monitoring, knowing that split fruit needs to be harvested quickly before rot sets in. As evening falls, you do your usual circuit, looking for storm damage, checking that water is draining properly, assessing whether any branches broke in the wind. Everything looks mostly fine, which is the best you can hope for. Not perfect, not undamaged, but fine. Your fruit is still developing. Your trees are still standing. You're still in the race to harvest before the 1,000 threats win. Tomorrow you'll get up and continue the vigilant monitoring, the constant small interventions, the exhausting multi-front war against nature that defines the pre-harvest period. For now, you eat a quick dinner and collapse into sleep, too tired even to properly worry about what tomorrow's inspections might reveal. It's mid-August, and the reality of harvest has arrived with all the grace of a cart with a broken wheel, which is to say, suddenly, inevitably, and with the promise of back-breaking labor. Your earliest apple varieties are showing color, blushing from green to yellow and red, and you're doing mental calculations that involve fruit ripeness, weather predictions, storage capacity, and the grim mathematics of how much you owe to the Lord versus how much your family needs to survive the winter. Harvest is supposed to be a time of abundance and celebration, but mostly it feels like panic with a side of exhaustion. You start with the early season apples, the ones that ripen in late July and early August. These are eating apples, meant to be consumed fresh because they don't store well. Within weeks they'll go mealy and bland. You pick them carefully, testing each apple for ripeness by feeling whether it comes away from the branch easily with a gentle twist. Ripe apples release cleanly. Unripe ones resist, and if you pull too hard you'll tear the fruiting spur and damage next year's crop. It's a delicate operation that requires patience you don't really have because there are hundreds of apples to pick and not enough hours in the day. Your whole family is involved in harvest. Your wife picks from the lower branches and sorts fruit. Your oldest child, 12 years old and finally useful for complex tasks, is up on the ladder picking the higher fruit. Your younger children gather fallen apples, separating the merely bruised from the completely rotten. Everyone has a role, and everyone is moving with the urgent energy that comes from knowing that unpicked fruit is wasted fruit, and wasted fruit could mean hunger in February. The sorting process happens immediately after picking. Perfect apples, unblemished, properly sized, exactly ripe, go into one basket. These are your trade goods, what you'll take to market or use to pay obligations. Slightly imperfect apples, small pest marks, minor bruising, odd shapes, go into a second basket for family consumption. Significantly damaged apples, bird pecks, codling moth holes, rot spots, get sorted into categories. Some will be cut up and the good parts saved, some will be pressed for cider, and some are too far gone for anything except feeding to livestock or composting. Here's the thing about medieval harvest that nobody tells you. You're working in a race against decomposition that starts the moment you pick the fruit. No refrigeration means everything is actively deteriorating, and you're trying to process and preserve faster than nature can reclaim your work. Apples that are perfect today will be slightly less perfect tomorrow and significantly worse in 3 days. You have to make immediate decisions about what gets eaten fresh, what gets dried, what gets cooked into preserves, and what gets pressed into cider. Delay means loss. The drying process is already underway. Your wife has set up frames near the cottage, wooden structures stretched with cloth, and she's slicing apples into thin rings that she spreads on the frames in single layers. The summer sun does the work of removing moisture, and if the weather cooperates, you'll have dried apple rings that will keep for months. If the weather doesn't cooperate, if rain comes, or if humidity stays high, or if nighttime dew is too heavy, the apples will mold before they dry, and you'll lose the batch. Drying fruit is basically a gamble with weather where you're betting your food preservation against atmospheric moisture content. Meanwhile, you're also preparing apples for immediate cooking. Preserves require honey or sugar, both expensive, but a portion of your crop has to be preserved this way because dried fruit alone won't provide enough variety to keep your family sane through winter. Your wife tends a pot over the fire, cooking down apple chunks with precious honey, stirring constantly to prevent burning. The result is a thick, sweet preserve that will be stored in ceramic pots sealed with cloth and wax. It'll keep until spring if stored properly, meaning in the coolest, darkest part of your cottage, checked regularly for signs of fermentation or mold. But the bulk of your apple processing will be cider. Cider is how medieval people preserve massive quantities of apples in drinkable form, and it's also how they avoid drinking questionable water. Hard cider, fermented apple juice with enough alcohol to be mildly antiseptic, is safer than water from streams that also serve as everyone's washing and waste disposal site. You don't understand germ theory, but you understand empirically that people who drink cider stay healthier than people who drink untreated water. The cider-making process is brutally physical. You've got a wooden press, a crude but functional device that consists of a screw mechanism, a wooden frame, and a collection barrel. You load apples into the press by the basketful, crushing them first with a wooden mallet into a chunky pulp. Then you layer the pulp in the press between wooden slats, building up alternating layers of pulp and spacers. When you've got a full load, you start turning the screw, applying pressure that squeezes juice from the pulp. The juice runs out through channels and drips into your collection barrel, slowly accumulating into gallons of sweet, fresh-pressed cider. The pressing work destroys your shoulders and back. You're turning a heavy screw against massive resistance, and medieval pressing technology offers no mechanical advantage beyond basic leverage. After an hour of pressing, your muscles are burning, and you've only processed maybe 2 bushels of apples. You've got dozens of bushels to process, which means days of pressing work spread across the harvest season. Your arms will ache continuously from August through October, and you'll wake up every morning feeling like you were beaten with sticks, which is more or less accurate in terms of physical stress. The fresh-pressed juice is delicious, sweet and tart, and intensely apple-flavored, but you don't drink much of it because it needs to ferment. You pour the juice into clay vessels or wooden barrels, cover them loosely to allow fermentation gases to escape, and let wild yeasts do their work. You don't add yeast because you don't know yeast exists as a thing you could add. You just trust that the yeasts living on the apple skins and in your pressing equipment will colonize the juice and convert sugar to alcohol. This works most of the time, though sometimes you get batches that go wrong. Vinegar instead of cider, or weird off flavors that make the cider barely drinkable. Historians still argue whether medieval peasants understood fermentation as a biological process or just as the thing that happens to fruit juice when you leave it alone. You're definitely in the second camp. You know that juice becomes cider, becomes vinegar if you leave it too long, and you know that temperature affects the process. Cooler conditions make slower, cleaner fermentation. But you don't know about yeast, bacteria, or biochemistry. You're just following patterns that work, passed down from your father and his father before him. While you're pressing apples, your wife is dealing with pears, which are ripening on their own schedule and require immediate attention because pears go from perfect to rotten faster than any other fruit. Pears are particularly frustrating because they ripen from the inside out, meaning they'll look firm and perfect on the outside while the core is already turning mushy. The only way to catch them at perfect ripeness is to pick them slightly early and let them finish ripening off the tree, which requires judgment and daily monitoring and a kind of fruit intuition that comes from years of practice. She's slicing pears for drying, cooking others into preserves, and setting aside the best ones for fresh eating while they're at peak flavor. Pear preservation is more difficult than apple preservation because pears brown quickly when cut and have higher water content that makes them harder to dry. But you can't afford to waste anything, so she's doing her best with the tools and knowledge available, which mostly means working fast and hoping enough of each batch survives to make the effort worthwhile. By mid-afternoon, you're all exhausted, and you've barely made a dent in the harvest. The orchard is still full of ripening fruit. More apples are coloring up every day. Your middle-season varieties will be ready in 2 weeks, and your late-season keepers will come in October. The harvest isn't a single event. It's a rolling crisis that lasts for months, demanding constant attention and labor. There's no finish line where you can relax. There's only the next variety ripening, the next batch to pick, the next round of processing and preservation. And then there's the spoilage problem you're discovering in real time. Some of the early apples you picked 3 days ago are already showing soft spots. You examine them and find that rot is spreading from minor bruises you didn't notice during picking. This is the eternal harvest dilemma. You can't pick so carefully that harvest takes forever, but careless picking leads to bruising that leads to rot that leads to loss. You're trying to find the balance point between speed and care, and you're not always successful. The rotting apples get sorted again. Parts that are still firm and edible get cut away and added to the cider press. Parts that are questionable get set aside for cooking immediately. High heat will kill most of the mold and bacteria, making them safer to eat, though the flavor might be compromised. Parts that are completely rotten go to compost. Every single apple is evaluated on a spectrum from perfectly preserved to completely lost, and you're trying to salvage whatever value you can from each point on that spectrum. Evening brings no relief because now you have to deal with nighttime fruit thieves. As your crop ripens and becomes visible and desirable, the risk of theft increases dramatically. You've already lost some fruit to daytime thieves, kids mostly grabbing apples and running, but nighttime theft is more organized and more damaging. Adults who are having bad harvest years, travelers passing through, or even neighbors who've convinced themselves that you won't miss a few apples. They all pose threats. You set up outside for night watch, wrapping yourself in a blanket and trying to stay alert despite bone-deep exhaustion. The orchard at night is alive with sounds. Wind in leaves, animals moving through grass, branches creaking, and you have to distinguish between normal sounds and the sounds of human intrusion. Every unusual noise makes your heart rate spike. You're holding a stout stick, not because you want to fight anyone, but because visible deterrence is the best theft prevention you've got. Around midnight, you hear definite human movement. You stand up and shout, "Who's there? Show yourself." There's a moment of frozen silence, then running footsteps heading away from the orchard. You don't pursue. That's dangerous and potentially futile, but you walk the perimeter checking for damage. You find evidence that someone was starting to pick from your most accessible tree, the one nearest the road. Maybe they got away with a few apples. Could have been worse. You note the location and make a mental plan to pick that tree first thing tomorrow, removing the temptation. You return to your watching post but don't sleep much. Night watching is less about catching thieves and more about making theft inconvenient enough that easier targets look more appealing. By morning, you're exhausted, but at least most of your crop is still intact. You eat a quick breakfast, bread and cheese and yesterday's apples, and head back into the orchard to continue picking. Your wife is already up and tending the drying frames, checking that last night's dew didn't ruin the partially dried fruit. The next 2 weeks blur into repetitive harvest labor. Pick, sort, process, preserve. Check the drying frames. Turn the fermentation vessels. Guard the orchard at night. Wake up exhausted and do it again. Your hands develop new calluses on top of old ones. Your back becomes a constant ache that never quite goes away. You lose weight despite eating more than usual because you're burning calories faster than you can replace them. This is medieval harvest. Abundance that requires such brutal labor to capture that you're not sure whether to celebrate the plenty or collapse from the effort of securing it. It's late September, and you're standing in your orchard looking at baskets of beautiful, perfectly ripe apples while doing the math that every medieval peasant dreads. Figuring out how much of your harvest actually belongs to you. Spoiler alert, It's not much. The feudal system is designed to extract value from your labor, and right now you're experiencing that extraction in its most visceral form as you count out apples and realize that most of them are going to someone else. First, there's the tithe to the church. 1/10 of your harvest, the word tithe literally means tenth, goes to support the local priest and parish. This isn't optional. This is backed by the full weight of religious and social pressure, and also by the very real threat of being ostracized or accused of impiety if you don't pay. The priest will come by to assess your harvest, and he's surprisingly good at estimating yields, probably because he's been collecting tithes for 20 years and has seen every trick that peasants try to pull to underreport their production. You've set aside your tithe apples in designated baskets, about 3 bushels in total, which represents a significant chunk of your crop. These are good apples too, because giving the church your worst fruit is both sinful and noticeable. The priest accepts them with a nod and a brief blessing, and you try not to think about how those apples could have fed your family for weeks. The church's reasoning is that spiritual welfare is more important than physical welfare, and you can't argue with that logic without risking accusations of heresy, so you don't argue. You just hand over the apples and feel the loss like a physical weight. But the tithe is just the beginning. You also owe feudal obligations to the Lord whose land you're working. These obligations come in multiple forms, and they're all designed to ensure that the Lord extracts maximum value from your labor. There's the straight produce rent. You owe a certain amount of fruit annually as payment for the right to work this orchard. The specific amount was established when your grandfather first took on this tenancy, and it's been passed down as part of the family obligation. You owe approximately 5 bushels of apples and 2 bushels of pears, delivered to the manor house at harvest time. You load these bushels onto your cart, a rickety wooden affair that you share with 2 other families, and make the trip to the manor. The manor's bailiff inspects your delivery with the critical eye of someone whose job is to ensure the Lord isn't being cheated. He pokes through your baskets, checking fruit quality, occasionally setting aside apples he deems unacceptable and demanding replacements. "This one's wormy," he says, holding up an apple that has a small codling moth hole that you hoped wouldn't be noticed. "Replace it." You bite your tongue and replace it with a perfect apple from your family's allocation, because arguing with the bailiff is pointless and potentially dangerous. He has the power to make your life much more difficult, increasing your labor obligations, claiming your cart is needed for manor work at inconvenient times, or just generally being obstructive in ways that medieval bureaucracy excels at. So you smile and nod and hand over the replacement apple and pretend that this is all perfectly reasonable. But wait, there's more. You also owe labor obligations, boon work, during harvest season. This means that for several days during the most critical harvest period, when your own fruit is ripening and needs immediate attention, you're required to work in the Lord's orchards and fields instead. This year, you owed 3 days of boon work, which you fulfilled last week by helping harvest the manor's grain and fruit. 3 days when you couldn't tend your own trees, couldn't pick your own fruit, couldn't process your own harvest. 3 days of watching your apples ripen past prime while you made someone else rich. The economics of feudalism are brutally clear when viewed through the lens of harvest obligations. You do all the year-round work, pruning, grafting, pest management, irrigation, and then when the harvest arrives, you have to give away roughly 40% of it to various authorities before you can even think about feeding your family. And that 40% is taken from the top, the best fruit, not the culls and seconds. You're left with the remainder to preserve, store, and stretch through an entire year until the next harvest. There are also the more obscure fees and obligations that pop up like unwelcome surprises. The Lord has instituted a fruit inspection fee, essentially a tax for having the manor's official inspector verify that your orchard is being properly maintained. This costs you 1/2 bushel of your best apples, paid to an inspector who spends about 15 minutes walking through your orchard and declaring it adequate. You suspect this fee is partly legitimate concern about orchard maintenance and partly just another mechanism for extracting value, but you can't prove it and wouldn't dare complain about it. Then there's the millage fee. Even though you're pressing your own cider with your own press, you're still required to pay a fee to the Lord who owns the water rights to the stream you use for washing your apples and for the water that powers the village mill. The fee is calculated as a percentage of your cider production, and yes, someone comes by to estimate how much cider you're making based on your apple harvest. This is somehow both impressively thorough and infuriatingly intrusive. You pay another half bushel of apples in lieu of liquid cider, because liquid is harder to transport and easier to dispute. Historians still argue whether the feudal system was mutually beneficial. Lords provided protection and organization, peasants provided labor and produce, or whether it was fundamentally exploitative. From your ground-level perspective, standing in your orchard doing the math on how little of your harvest you get to keep, it sure feels like exploitation. But you also know that the alternative, trying to work land without the Lord's protection, outside the feudal structure, is basically impossible. Unprotected peasants get their land stolen by more powerful neighbors, or get drafted into worse arrangements with less scrupulous lords, or just starve because they can't access the resources and infrastructure that come with feudal organization. So you pay your obligations, and you try to minimize them through various semi-legitimate means. You slightly underreport your yield, claiming that your harvest was merely adequate when it was actually pretty good. You deliver your tithe and rent obligations using medium-sized baskets that hold less than the standard bushel, hoping nobody measures too carefully. You pick the largest apples for your family and deliver slightly smaller ones as payment, gambling that the size difference won't be noticed. These are small acts of resistance, tiny ways of clawing back a bit of the value that's being extracted from your labor. But you have to be careful, because getting caught trying to cheat on your obligations can have serious consequences. There are legal codes governing fruit production, and they're surprisingly detailed. The Statute of Laborers, passed recently in response to labor shortages after the plague, has provisions about agricultural production and fair payment, though fair is very much from the Lord's perspective. There are also local customary laws about orchard management, fruit quality standards, and dispute resolution. Last year, a guy 3 villages over got caught systematically underreporting his pear harvest. The manor court fined him an additional 2 bushels on top of his regular obligations and increased his boon work requirement for the following year as punishment. Word of his punishment spread quickly. Medieval communities are small and everyone knows everyone's business, and it served as an effective warning to anyone else considering similar strategies. You heard the story and mentally adjusted your own underreporting to stay well within the bounds of plausible deniability. There are also inheritance laws governing orchards. Your tenancy is hereditary, meaning your children will inherit the right to work this land and the obligations that come with it, but only if the Lord approves the succession. When your father died, you had to pay a heriot, essentially a death tax, to the Lord before you could take over the orchard. You paid with your father's best tools and a portion of that year's harvest, and in return you got official recognition as the new tenant. This system ensures that the Lord maintains control over land transfer and extracts value even from death and succession. Property disputes are handled by the manor court, which meets periodically to address grievances. You've attended a few times, mostly as a witness in disputes between neighbors about boundary trees and overhanging branches. The court is theoretically impartial but is presided over by the Lord's bailiff, so outcomes tend to favor interpretations that benefit the manor. You've learned to be very careful about boundary maintenance and to document your orchard's borders clearly, because losing even a single row of trees to an adverse boundary determination could be financially devastating. As you're finishing your obligation deliveries and returning to your orchard to focus on what remains for your family, you pass the manor orchard and can't help but notice how much easier the Lord's orchard keeper has it. He's got access to better tools, more labor during critical periods, and superior planting stock. The manor orchard has varieties you've never seen, probably imported from France or grafted from monastery stock. The trees are better spaced, better maintained, and produce higher quality fruit than yours. This isn't because the manor's keeper is more skilled. You'd wager you know as much about apple growing as he does. It's because the feudal system concentrates resources upward, giving advantages to those who already have advantages. But dwelling on the unfairness is pointless and possibly dangerous. Complaints about the social order can be interpreted as dangerous thinking, and dangerous thinking can get you in trouble with both secular and religious authorities. So you focus on what you can control, maximizing the value of the harvest portion that's actually yours. You've got about 15 bushels of apples and 5 bushels of pears remaining after all obligations are paid. This has to feed your family, provide seed for next year's grafting, and serve as emergency reserves in case next year's harvest fails. You spend the evening with your wife doing detailed planning. Which apples will be eaten fresh in the next month? Which will be dried? Which will be pressed for cider? Which will be carefully stored as fresh fruit, packed in straw in the coolest part of your cottage, checked weekly for rot? Every apple is accounted for in a mental spreadsheet that balances immediate needs against winter survival. It's exhausting and stressful, and you're acutely aware that one miscalculation, eating too much fresh fruit early, losing a batch to rot, misjudging storage conditions, could mean hunger in March. As you finally settle down for the night, you do a final mental calculation. After a full year of labor, fighting pests and disease and weather and thieves, you get to keep about 60% of what you grew. 60%. The rest went to church, lord, fees, inspectors, and the grinding machinery of feudal extraction. You're too tired to be properly angry about it. You're just relieved that your obligations are paid. You won't face legal trouble, and your family has enough to survive another year. Medieval success isn't prosperity. It's just managing to avoid disaster for one more harvest cycle. October arrives with cold mornings and the kind of damp chill that seeps into your bones and stays there. And you're racing to finish the late-season harvest before the first hard frost turns your remaining fruit into expensive compost. Your storage apples, the late-maturing varieties bred specifically to keep through winter, are finally ready, and this is simultaneously your most important and most precarious harvest. These are the apples that have to last until spring, and if you mess up either the picking or the storage, your family will be eating nothing but grain porridge and dried turnips by February. You're picking with obsessive care now, even more than usual, because storage apples can't have any damage at all. Even a small bruise becomes a rot entry point that will spread through storage and potentially destroy multiple apples. You're examining each apple as you twist it from the branch, looking for pest damage, checking for soft spots, rejecting anything that's not absolutely perfect. Your reject pile is distressingly large. Maybe 20% of the fruit gets culled, but you can't afford to compromise because one bad apple literally does spoil the barrel, and that's not just a metaphor, it's agricultural reality. The weather is also becoming a factor in ways it hasn't been since spring. Last night's temperature dropped close to freezing, and you're worried about frost damage to fruit still on the tree. Apples can handle light frost. Actually, some varieties improve in flavor after a light frost, but a hard freeze will damage cell structure and make the fruit worthless for storage. You're watching the sky obsessively, interpreting cloud cover and wind direction like an amateur meteorologist, because you don't have weather forecasts and you're making harvest timing decisions based on folk wisdom and gut feeling. Red sky at night, shepherd's delight. Red sky in morning, shepherd's warning. You mutter the rhyme to yourself as you watch the sunrise, which is aggressively red and probably means weather is coming. You need at least 2 more days to finish picking your storage varieties, and you're hoping the weather holds that long. Medieval agriculture is basically a constant prayer that nature will cooperate just long enough for you to finish whatever critical task you're currently attempting. While you're picking, you're also dealing with wasps, which are having their aggressive autumn surge. Wasps in October are desperate and mean, attracted to the sugar in ripening fruit, and they'll sting without much provocation. You've been stung twice already this morning, and each sting is a painful reminder that even at the end of harvest season, nature is still trying to make your life difficult. You can't eliminate the wasps, they're too numerous and too mobile, so you just work carefully, watching for them, moving slowly to avoid triggering attacks, and accepting that some stings are inevitable. Your youngest child comes running from the cottage with news that makes your heart sink. Some of the dried apples that were stored in the shed have developed mold. This is a disaster. Dried fruit is supposed to be stable, but if it wasn't dried thoroughly enough, or if the storage area is too humid, or if there was any moisture intrusion, mold can grow and ruin entire batches. You abandon your picking and rush to investigate, already running through the mental calculation of how much food you might have lost. The damage is bad but not catastrophic. About a quarter of your dried apples show visible mold growth, white or greenish fuzz on the surface. These are total losses. There's no saving moldy dried fruit. You gather them up to feed to animals or compost, trying not to think too hard about the hours of labor that went into slicing, drying, and storing them. The remaining dried apples look okay, but you're moving them immediately to a drier location, hanging bags from the cottage rafters where they'll be exposed to smoke from the fire, which both dries them further and provides some antimicrobial protection. Historians still argue whether medieval preservation techniques were effective or whether people just accepted massive food losses as inevitable. You're definitely experiencing the massive losses part, but you're also constantly adjusting and learning, trying to minimize future damage. Every loss teaches you something. Dry fruit more thoroughly, check storage areas more frequently, use smoke drying for anything you're particularly worried about. It's trial and error at a scale where errors mean hunger, so you're motivated to learn fast. By afternoon, a storm is definitely moving in. You can feel it in the air pressure, in the way the wind picks up and shifts direction, in how the birds are acting nervous and feeding frantically before the weather arrives. You make the decision to pick everything that's even remotely ripe, even if it means harvesting some apples that could have used another week on the tree. Better to pick them slightly early than to lose them to storm damage or freezing temperatures. You and your family work frantically for the next 4 hours, picking until your arms are screaming and your baskets are overflowing. The wind is increasing, branches are swaying, and you're starting to get hit by the first scattered raindrops. You're up on the ladder reaching for the last few apples on your highest tree when the rain really starts, cold and driving, soaking through your wool tunic within minutes. You climb down carefully, wet wood is slippery wood, and help carry the final baskets to shelter just as the storm fully arrives. The storm lasts through the night and into the next day. Wind, rain, and temperatures that drop toward freezing. You sit inside your cottage listening to branches crack and fall, hoping your trees are surviving, knowing there's nothing you can do but wait. Medieval storm response is basically take shelter, pray, and assess damage when it's over. You spend the time sorting and processing the apples you harvested yesterday, working by firelight, trying to stay productive while anxiety gnaws at you. When the storm finally clears, you go out to survey the damage. Could have been worse. You've lost a few branches, nothing structural, but enough to impact next year's production. The ground is littered with fallen fruit, mostly immature apples that weren't ready for harvest anyway, knocked down by wind. A few of your trees are leaning slightly, root systems compromised by the saturated soil and wind pressure. You'll need to stake them and hope they stabilize, but there's a real chance you'll lose 1 or 2 over the winter. But the bigger problem is what you discover when you check on the fruit you picked before the storm. Some of it got wet during the frantic final harvest in the rain, and wet apples don't store well. Water on the skin creates ideal conditions for fungal spores to germinate, and you're already seeing the beginning of storage rot on a few apples. You spend hours sorting through your storage crop, removing any apple that shows moisture, damage, or early rot signs. These get moved to immediate consumption or cider pressing, which reduces your winter storage reserves but prevents worse losses later. Storage itself is its own complex challenge. You're using your cottage's coolest area, a corner that stays relatively cold because it's against a stone wall and away from the fire. You've laid down clean straw as bedding and you're arranging apples in single layers, not touching each other, checked and rotated weekly. The goal is to keep them cold enough to slow respiration and ripening, but not so cold they freeze, and dry enough to prevent rot, but not so dry they shrivel. It's a narrow environmental window, and maintaining it requires constant attention. You've also wrapped some of your best storage apples individually in leaves or dry grass, creating tiny protective bundles that help regulate moisture and provide some cushioning. This is time-consuming work. You can only wrap maybe 50 apples in an evening, but those individually wrapped apples have the best chance of lasting until spring. They're your insurance policy against late winter hunger, and you're treating them with the reverence they deserve. There are also folk beliefs about storage that you follow because, well, you follow them. Apples stored during the waning moon supposedly keep better than apples stored during the waxing moon. Apples should never be stored near onions or potatoes because they'll absorb flavors. Singing to your stored fruit helps it last longer, or at least that's what your grandmother claimed, and you're not going to risk it by not singing. Medieval food preservation is part science, part superstition, and part desperate hope that you're doing something right. The autumn work isn't finished just because the harvest is complete. You're also preparing your orchard for winter, and this involves a whole new set of tasks. You're pruning out the storm-damaged branches and any diseased wood you've identified during the growing season. You're raking up fallen leaves and fruit, removing potential disease harbors. You're spreading the compost you've been accumulating all year around the base of your trees, giving them a nutrient boost before winter dormancy. You're also performing what amounts to orchard triage, identifying which trees are declining and might not be worth keeping. That pear tree in the soggy spot that's been struggling all season is probably not going to recover, and you might need to remove it and plant a replacement in a better location. The apple tree that got severe fire blight, you'll give it one more season to see if it recovers, but you're mentally preparing to lose it. Medieval orchard management involves accepting that trees die and need to be replaced, and that replacement cycle is just part of the long-term work of maintaining a productive orchard. There's also the delicate work of protecting young trees from winter damage. You're wrapping trunks with cloth or straw to prevent sunscald, damage that happens when winter sun heats bark during the day and then freezing temperatures hit at night, causing the bark to crack. You're checking that your vole barriers are intact and that no rodent tunnels have developed over the summer. You're generally trying to prepare your trees for the coming months of cold, ice, wind, and dormancy. As the days grow shorter and colder, you're also doing final calculations on whether you have enough food to make it through winter. You count your storage apples, estimate your cider supply, assess your dried fruit, and add it all to the grain and vegetables and preserved foods from other sources. The math is tight. If winter is mild and nothing goes wrong, you'll be fine. If winter is harsh, or if you have unusual losses, or if someone gets sick and can't work, you'll be hungry by March. This is just the reality of medieval subsistence agriculture. You're always one bad season away from real trouble. On the evening of the autumn equinox, which you mark not with calendars but by observing the sun's position and the changing light, you perform a small ritual that your father taught you and his father taught him. You take the last apple from your harvest, the very last one picked, and you bury it at the base of your oldest tree. This is an offering to the orchard, a thank you for another year of production, and a prayer for successful production next year. It's part pagan tradition, part practical magic, and you're not entirely sure you believe it works, but you do it anyway because tradition has weight and meaning even when you can't fully explain why. As you stand in your orchard in the fading autumn light, Trees bare now except for a few stubborn leaves. You allow yourself a moment of exhausted satisfaction. You survived another year. Your trees are still standing. Your family has food stored for winter. The endless cycle of labor has completed another revolution, and soon, very soon, you'll begin again, with winter pruning and spring grafting and the perpetual work of coaxing fruit from reluctant trees. But for tonight, you're done. The harvest is in, the orchard is prepared, and you can finally, briefly, rest. Winter arrives with the kind of cold that makes you question whether you've ever actually been warm or if warmth was just a pleasant hallucination you had during summer. It's early January now, the darkest part of the year, and your orchard stands bare and skeletal against gray skies, trees dormant and waiting for spring. You might think this is the season when orchard work finally stops, when you get to rest after the exhausting marathon of the growing season. You would be wrong. Winter orchard work is different from summer orchard work, but it's no less essential, and it comes with its own special brand of misery that involves frozen fingers and the constant risk of injury. You're out in the orchard before dawn, which arrives shamefully late in January, doing your winter pruning. This is actually the best time to prune, when trees are fully dormant, when you can see their structure clearly without leaves obscuring the branch architecture, when cuts heal cleanly because sap isn't flowing. But it's also absolutely brutal work because you're wielding sharp tools with numb hands and temperatures that make metal tools painful to grip. Your pruning saw is so cold it feels like it's burning your palms, and you have to stop regularly to warm your hands over a small fire you've built at the orchard edge. Winter pruning is about making big structural decisions that will affect the tree for years. You're removing entire limbs, not just the small stuff you cleaned up during summer. You're opening up tree centers to improve light penetration and air circulation. You're removing crossing branches that rub against each other and create wounds. You're cutting back overly vigorous growth and encouraging fruiting wood. Each cut requires thought and judgment, and you're making these decisions while your brain is slightly foggy from cold and your body is screaming at you to go back inside where the fire is. The physical mechanics of winter pruning are complicated by the weather. Wood is harder when it's cold. Literally, the frozen sap makes it denser and more difficult to cut. Your saw binds more frequently. Your pruning cuts require more effort. And when you're cutting overhead, sawdust and ice crystals rain down into your face and down your collar, which is exactly as unpleasant as it sounds. You're basically torturing yourself in the name of future fruit production, and you're doing it because skipping winter pruning means worse harvests for the next several years. You're working on a particularly gnarly old apple tree when your saw slips and you cut your hand. It's not deep, more of a gash than anything serious, but it's bleeding and it hurts, and it's the kind of injury that's both common and potentially dangerous in medieval times. You wrap it with a strip of cloth torn from your already tattered shirt, and you keep working because stopping isn't really an option. You'll clean it properly when you go inside, maybe apply some of the honey-based salve your wife makes for wounds, and hope it doesn't get infected. That's medieval workplace safety. Hope for the best and keep working. By mid-morning, you've pruned 6 trees, and you've got maybe 30 more to go before the pruning season ends. You're working systematically through the orchard, making decisions tree by tree, and you're also collecting the pruned branches for various uses. Thicker branches become firewood. Straight, thin branches become stakes and supports. Some of the best wood gets set aside for grafting stock. Nothing is wasted because waste is a luxury you can't afford. While you're pruning, you're also looking for winter damage and pest problems. Ice storms can break branches. Heavy snow can bend them permanently. Deer that are desperate for food might have browsed on bark. You're checking each tree for problems, making notes about which ones need special attention in spring, which ones are declining and might need to be replaced, which ones are thriving and should be used as sources for grafting wood. You discover mouse damage on several young trees, places where mice have gnawed bark under the snow cover, creating wounds that could be serious if they've girdled the trunk. You clear snow away from the base of these trees and inspect the damage carefully. Most of it looks superficial, but one tree has lost bark all the way around about a third of its circumference. This is serious but not immediately fatal. You'll need to watch it carefully in spring, maybe do bridge grafting if the damage is severe enough. Bridge grafting is a technique where you graft new wood across a damaged section to restore nutrient flow, and it's delicate, finicky work that doesn't always succeed. The other winter task you're tackling is collecting grafting wood. You're cutting scions, pencil-thick sections of last year's growth from your best-performing trees, and storing them for spring grafting. The wood has to be collected while the trees are dormant, and it has to be stored properly. Buried in damp sand on the north side of your cottage where it stays cold but doesn't freeze solid. You're selecting your scion wood carefully, choosing straight sections with good bud spacing, avoiding anything diseased or damaged. This wood represents your future orchard improvements, and you're treating it with appropriate care. By afternoon, you're so cold that your muscles are cramping and you're starting to lose fine motor control, which is dangerous when you're working with sharp tools 15 feet up a ladder. You make the wise decision to stop for the day, clean and store your tools, and head inside. Your cottage is warm, relative to outside anyway, and your wife has hot pottage waiting. You eat mechanically, too cold and tired to really taste anything, and then you sit by the fire trying to restore feeling to your extremities. But you can't rest for long because there's inside work that needs doing. Winter is when you repair and maintain all the tools and equipment that keep the orchard functioning. You're sharpening your pruning tools, sanding handles smooth, replacing broken parts, doing all the maintenance you didn't have time for during the growing season. Your pruning saw gets filed until each tooth is sharp and even. Your grafting knife gets honed to razor sharpness. Your ladder gets inspected and broken rungs get replaced. This is tedious work, but it's essential because good tools make the difference between efficient work and dangerous, exhausting struggle. You're also making new tools during the winter. You're carving new pruning hooks from hardwood, shaping them carefully and fitting them with handles. You're making more stakes for supporting young trees. You're weaving baskets from willow withies that you collected in the fall. Medieval winters are for production, making the things you'll need when the busy season starts again. There's no such thing as true rest, just a shift from outdoor physical labor to indoor manufacturing and maintenance. The social fabric of winter is different too. With outdoor work limited by weather and daylight, people have more time for visiting, and your cottage becomes a venue for the kind of community interaction that sustains medieval villages through the dark months. Neighbors stop by to share news, exchange tools, discuss plans for spring. There's a lot of agricultural knowledge transfer that happens in these informal winter gatherings. Someone mentions a new pruning technique they learned from a traveling monk. Someone else describes a pest control method that worked for them, and you all file this information away for future use. Historians still argue whether medieval agricultural communities were primarily cooperative or competitive, but from your perspective it's both simultaneously. You cooperate because you have to, no one survives alone, but you also compete for resources, status, and the finite surplus that determines who thrives and who merely survives. These winter conversations are simultaneously genuine knowledge sharing and subtle intelligence gathering about who's planning what, who's struggling, who might have surplus to trade come spring. As January fades into February, the work continues. You're pruning in whatever weather allows it. You're maintaining tools. You're checking on stored fruit and cider, removing apples that show rot before they can contaminate their neighbors, tasting cider to make sure fermentation hasn't gone wrong. You're planning your spring grafting campaign, deciding which rootstocks will get which varieties, imagining the orchard you're slowly building toward. You're also dealing with the reality that winter is when stored food starts to run low and hunger becomes a real presence in your life. The apples that seemed like such abundance in October are dwindling. Some have rotted despite your best storage efforts. Some have been eaten. Some went to unexpected obligations or trades. By February, you're rationing carefully, calculating how many apples per day your family can eat and still have some left to reach the spring garden harvest. The math is uncomfortable, and you're eating less than you'd like, losing weight, feeling the constant low-grade stress of not quite enough. This is when you truly understand that your orchard isn't a hobby or a side project. It's a survival mechanism. The fruit you grew last year is keeping your family alive right now. The trees you're tending in the bitter cold will produce the fruit that keeps you alive next winter. It's a cycle that extends backward and forward through time, connecting last year's labor to this year's survival to next year's hope. Medieval agriculture is less about individual harvests and more about maintaining this cycle across years and generations. On a particularly cold February morning, you're checking your young trees when you notice something that makes your heart lift slightly. Tiny swellings on the branches that indicate dormancy is beginning to break. Spring is still weeks away, but the trees know it's coming. Sap is starting to move. Buds are preparing to open. The cycle is turning again, inevitable and reassuring. You've survived another winter. Your trees have survived. Soon you'll be grafting and pruning and fighting pests and all the other exhausting work of the growing season. But right now, in this cold morning light, you just feel grateful that you made it through. You walk back to your cottage, thinking about the generations before you who did this same work, and the generations after who will inherit these trees and this knowledge. Your children are growing up learning orchard craft, not from books or formal instruction, but from watching you work, helping with small tasks, absorbing the rhythms and requirements of coaxing fruit from trees. Your oldest is already competent at grafting. Your middle child has a good eye for spotting pest damage. They're learning to read weather, judge ripeness, calculate yields. They're becoming orchardists through immersion in the work, the same way you learned from your father. This continuity is both comforting and sobering. Comforting because the knowledge will persist, because your children will be able to feed their children using skills you're teaching them now. Sobering because this is their future too. Endless cycles of labor, fighting the same battles you fight, hoping for harvests that justify the work. You want better for them, but better isn't really an option in the medieval social structure. They'll be orchardists because you're an orchardist because your father was an orchardist, and social mobility is basically a fantasy for people in your position. But there's also pride in the work. You've mastered something genuinely difficult. You understand trees in ways that most people don't. You can look at an apple tree and read its history in branch structure and bark texture. You can predict yields months before harvest. You can diagnose problems and implement solutions with limited tools and resources. This knowledge is valuable and hard-won, and it's worth something even if it doesn't make you wealthy or free you from feudal obligations. As winter reluctantly loosens its grip and the days begin to lengthen, you start preparing for spring work. You're organizing your grafting supplies. You're planning your pruning priorities. You're watching the weather for signs of when the last hard frost might occur. You're ready to begin again, to throw yourself into another year of orchard work. Because what else are you going to do? This is your life for better or worse. This is the deal your grandfather made, and you're living with the consequences, and your children will live with them after you. And honestly, despite the cold and the hunger and the exhaustion and the futile extraction and the endless grinding labor, there are worse lives available in the medieval world. You're not a landless vagrant. You're not a serf bound to the plow with no hope of anything better. You're not a soldier dying in some lord's war. You're an orchardist with trees and skills and a future that looks roughly like your present, which is a form of security even if it's not prosperity. You've survived another day in a medieval orchard, and tomorrow you'll do it again, and the day after that, and the day after that, in the eternal cycle of growth and harvest and dormancy that defines your existence. The light is fading now, evening arriving early as it does in winter. You bank the fire, check that your stored fruit is secure, and settle down for the night. Tomorrow you'll prune more trees. Next week, you'll start spring preparations. Next month, you'll be grafting. The cycle never stops, but tonight, right now, you can rest. Your eyes close, your breathing slows. Sleep takes you, and in your dreams, maybe you see spring blossoms and laden branches and perfectly ripe fruit. The aspirational version of orchard keeping that keeps you going through the difficult reality. Sweet dreams of apples that never rot, trees that never sicken, harvests that never fail. Just for tonight, in the space between waking and sleeping, it's all perfect. And then tomorrow comes and you'll do it all over again. The orchard settles into its winter stillness as you drift deeper into sleep. The trees outside stand sentinel in the cold darkness, their bare branches tracing delicate patterns against the night sky. They're patient, these trees, knowing that spring will come again, that life will return, that the cycle continues regardless of individual struggles. There's something eternal about orchards, something that outlasts the people who tend them. Your grandfather planted some of these trees. Your grandchildren might harvest from them. The work continues, generation after generation, season after season, in the quiet persistence of roots pushing through soil and branches reaching toward sun. Tomorrow's worries can wait. Tonight, let the cold wind whisper through bare branches. Let the frost settle silver on sleeping earth. Let the darkness be complete and restful. You've earned this rest. You've survived another day in the medieval orchard, with all its challenges and dangers and endless demands. For now, that's enough. Let sleep come gently, softly, carrying you into dreams of warmer days and easier work, even though you know that medieval orchard keeping is never truly easy. But in dreams, anything is possible. In dreams, every apple is perfect, every harvest abundant, every season kind. Rest now. Tomorrow waits with its own demands, but tonight you sleep.